fermenting sorghum, particularly using fungal cultures, could significantly increase the protein content and also improve digestibility. They even mentioned a potential 20% increase in protein content, which is pretty remarkable.
Wow, a 20% jump, that's huge.
A whole new era of communication in the global aquaculture industry is coming. Now you have the brightest minds in aquaculture right in your pocket. And what's best? You can listen to all of them while driving to a farm, traveling, or running errands. It's never been this good, and it's never been this simple. Welcome to the Aquaculture Podcast Show, the first AI-based podcast in aquaculture, where you'll find cutting-edge insights in everything that's working in aquaculture, nutrition, health, and production.
Welcome to the Aquaculture Podcast Show. We're diving into a study that's causing a bit of a stir in the aquaculture world today, looking at the potential of sorghum as a sustainable alternative to fish meal in aquafeeds.
Yeah, definitely a hot topic.
And finding those sustainable protein sources for aquafeed, that's a challenge we're always facing, right?
Yeah.
And this research, it really digs into, the potential for sorghum to kind of step up and play a bigger role.
It really does. And I think what makes this study so interesting is it doesn't shy away from the complexities. It looks at both the opportunities and the hurdles, which I think is really refreshing.
Yeah, for sure. There's no silver bullet, is there?
Right.
When it comes to sustainable aquaculture.
Yeah.
So let's just start with the basics. Why sorghum in the first place? What's the appeal?
Well, the study points to a few key factors. First off, sorghum is a global powerhouse. It's the 5th most produced grain worldwide, and the U.S. is a major player in that. So, that means there's some supply chain stability there, which is really important for any feed ingredient.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's not just about quantity, it's about resilience too, right? This grain, it can thrive in conditions where other crops struggle. Think about drought-prone regions. So from a sustainability perspective, that's a huge plus.
Absolutely. And when you look at its nutritional composition, sorghum's got a lot to offer. It's a good source of carbohydrates, unsaturated fatty acids. It's got those micronutrients like potassium and magnesium, which we know are essential for fish health.
But let's be real, the protein content, that's what really matters when it comes to aquafeed.
Right.
How does sorghum stack up? What did the research say?
Yeah, well, that's where things get a little bit more nuanced. The protein content in sorghum, it can range from about 6% to 15%. Now, that really depends on the variety and the growing conditions. It's not as high as some other plant-based protein sources out there, but, it's not negligible. It's still a considerable amount.
And I imagine the amino acid profile is a big piece of the puzzle here, too.
Absolutely.
What does the study have to say about that?
Yeah, it highlights that sorghum is a little bit lower in some of those essential amino acids, things like lysine, threonine, and methionine. And these are crucial for growth, especially when you're talking about carnivorous fish. So that's a challenge we've got to address.
So it's not just a simple swap, right?
Not quite, no.
Okay.
The study really emphasizes that we need strategic feed formulations.
I see.
We might need to combine sorghum with other protein sources to hit that optimal amino acid balance for different fish species. It's not one size fits all.
So we've got this promising, resilient crop, a decent nutritional profile, but it's not perfect when it comes to protein. And I know from reading the study that digestibility, that's a big hurdle.
It is.
Can you break that down for us a little bit? What's going on there?
Yeah, so the research shows that sorghum has lower protein digestibility compared to some of the other common feed ingredients like corn or wheat. And this is especially problematic for carnivorous fish, things like sunshine bass.
Yeah, I was reading about that, and the study digs into some of the reasons behind that, right?
Yeah.
It's not just a simple matter of protein content, there's more to it.
Exactly. There are a few culprits at play. One of them is the presence of these caffeine proteins. They're tightly bound, so it's hard for enzymes to break them down.
So they're kind of locked away.
Yeah, you could think of them like the Fort Knox of the sorghum grain, right? Holding those nutrients captive.
Interesting analogy. So it's not just about how much protein is there, it's how available is that protein for the fish to actually use?
Precisely, yeah. And then you've also got the issue of encapsulated starch. This reduces digestibility as well because the starch granules are basically wrapped up in a protective layer.
Adding another layer of complexity.
It does.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we can't forget about that high fiber content and those anti-nutritional factors, those tannins, phytates, they're in there too. All these things further reduce nutrient availability.
Right.
And can really impact feed efficiency. So it's a multifaceted challenge for sure. Sounds like it. So there's a real need for some innovative solutions if sorghum is going to be a viable alternative to fish meal. And, that's exactly what we're going to explore in the next part of our deep dive. Okay, so we know that digestibility can be a major hurdle when we're talking about using sorghum in aquafeeds. But the good news is this study doesn't just stop there. It goes on to explore some really, really fascinating potential solutions, ways to kind of crack this nut. So what really stood out to you in that regard?
Well, there's a lot to unpack there, but I'd say one of the most promising avenues is fermentation. The research really suggests that fermenting sorghum, particularly using fungal cultures, could significantly increase the protein content and also improve digestibility. They even mentioned a potential 20% increase in protein content, which is pretty remarkable.
Wow, a 20% jump, that's huge. But, for my own work, fermentation can be a little bit of a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah, that's true. How do we make sure that we don't compromise palatability in the process? Because it's one thing to have all the nutrients there, but if the fish aren't going to eat it, it defeats the purpose.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's a $1 million question. It's one thing to make it nutritious, but if they won't eat it, what's the point? And the study, they emphasize that we need to do a lot more research. We need to optimize those fermentation processes, not only to improve the digestibility, but also to make sure the fish will still eat it, preserve that palatability. And I think that's where sensory analysis comes in.
Right.
And feed intake studies, those become crucial to really understand how the fish are responding.
Totally. We need to get a handle on how fermentation impacts not just the nutrients, but the taste, the texture, the whole experience for the fish, right?
Absolutely.
Speaking of more targeted approaches, I know the study also talked about using enzyme supplementation, right?
Yeah, exactly. They specifically highlighted using phytase to help break down phytic acid, which we know is an anti-nutrient that's found in sorghum. And so the idea is if we can reduce the levels of phytic acid, that's going to help improve how well those minerals, things like phosphorus and zinc, are absorbed by the fish.
And phytase, that's already being used pretty extensively in some animal feeds, right?
Yeah, that's right. So there's a pretty solid knowledge base there that we can build on, which is helpful.
That's a good point. Now, I'm also curious about the whole probiotics, prebiotics thing. That seems to be getting a lot of attention in aquaculture nutrition these days.
Yeah, for good reason. It's a really exciting area. And, the study touched on that as well. It pointed to some pretty interesting findings.
Okay.
They were looking at tilapia fed with sorghum-based diets. And they found that using probiotics and prebiotics had a really positive impact on growth performance and immune function. So, that gut microbiome, it plays a huge role in how fish utilize those nutrients. It's not just about the food itself.
So if we can kind of hack the gut microbiome, that could be another key to really unlocking the full potential of sorghum.
That's exactly right. It's about thinking beyond the feed itself and understanding, how can we create the best possible gut environment to maximize those nutrient absorption. And I think that's where the real innovation lies. It's this holistic approach to feed formulation and nutrition management.
That makes sense. It's not just a one-for-one swap. It's thinking about the whole system.
Yeah.
Now, I know the study also touched on, maybe a more long-term and potentially controversial solution, which is genetic modification. I'm curious to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's right. They did mention that as a possibility. It's a pretty powerful tool, and it's an area where there's a lot of ongoing research. The idea is, what if we could engineer sorghum varieties that have those inherently more digestible proteins?
Right, that would be amazing.
Yeah, so maybe by reducing the disulfide bonds in those kefirine proteins, making them easier to break down. You can imagine having sorghum varieties specifically tailored to be optimal for aquaculture.
Yeah, that would be a game changer.
Yeah, absolutely.
But of course, we've got to think about the whole regulatory landscape around genetically modified organisms and what the public perception of that is.
Oh, absolutely. And that's a whole other conversation, right? It's a really complex issue with ethical and social implications that we have to consider very carefully. But, just from a purely scientific perspective, I think the potential is really there.
It's a good reminder that innovation in aquaculture, it's not just about the science. It's about navigating a complex web of scientific, social, and economic factors.
Very true.
But let's not forget about the big picture here. This research, it's really trying to address a critical issue, and that's the sustainability of aquafeed, right?
Absolutely. And that brings us right to the heart of the matter. Can sorghum really live up to its potential as a sustainable fish meal alternative? That's the question.
And that's what we're going to explore as we wrap up our deep dive today. All right, so we've really covered a lot of ground here, from that nutritional profile of sorghum to the digestibility challenges, and then all those innovative solutions that researchers are looking into. But when we step back and look at the big picture, what does it all mean for the future of aquaculture? Can sorghum really step up and be a sustainable fish meal alternative?
I think the study makes a pretty strong case for, well, maybe cautious optimism. It lays out both the challenges and the opportunities, and I appreciate that. We can't sugarcoat it. There are hurdles.
Right.
But the research also points to some really exciting possibilities, some real potential there.
Yeah, and it's not just about swapping out fish meal for, one other ingredient. It's really about, taking a fresh look at how we formulate aquafeeds, maybe reimagining the whole process.
Exactly. We need to be thinking in terms of integrated solutions, right? So combining different protein sources, optimizing those feeding strategies, and even, like we talked about, looking at novel approaches, things like, manipulating the gut microbiome. It's about that holistic approach. You got to consider the whole life cycle of the fish, and the environmental impact of how we produce aquaculture. It's all connected.
And I think this research really pushes us to think outside the box. It's not just about finding a sustainable alternative. It's about building a more resilient and efficient aquaculture system from the ground up.
Absolutely. And that's where I think sorghum has a real chance to make a difference. It's a resilient crop. It can adapt to different growing conditions, and we can integrate it into all kinds of different farming systems. I think that makes it a really strong contender as we move towards a future where sustainability and food security are just paramount.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's a good reminder that innovation in aquaculture, it's not about finding that one magic solution, right? It's about pushing those boundaries, embracing that complexity, and working together, collaborating across disciplines to find solutions that are good for people and good for the planet.
Well said. And this research, it gives us a roadmap. It's like a call to action for all of us, for researchers, feed formulators, producers, everyone in the aquaculture space, to keep exploring, keep experimenting, keep striving for a more sustainable and food secure future. It's on us.
Couldn't agree more. So to all our listeners out there, the ones who are really driving innovation in aquaculture, keep diving deep, keep asking those tough questions, and keep pushing those boundaries. The future of aquaculture, well, depends on it.
If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to follow the Aquaculture Podcast Show on your favorite platform. And don't forget to follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook to stay updated on the latest episodes and industry insights. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time.